And so before I turn it over to LACH, please join me as we unite our hearts in a spirit of prayer. God of Shalom, peaceful one, Spirit of peace. In our Lenten journey toward the cross, we are painfully aware of the many circumstances of violence that crucify your children every day. We grieve this injustice and seek to be instruments of your peace in this broken and beautiful world longing to be made whole. In this time of learning and sharing, open us to one another and to you. Help us to create safe space through listening and authentic sharing. Help us to honor each life experience, each perspective, as we weave our experiences and our journeys together in a tapestry of discernment and shared journey. As a people who see violence, but proclaim peace. Bless our time in this session is my prayer in the name of Christ Jesus, our peace. Amen.
As we begin this evening, I want to draw your attention to the church history principles that are referenced in the preparation materials. A few of the 9 principles are particularly helpful to build tonight's discussion on. Number 1, continuing exploration of our history is part of identity formation. Number 2, history informs but does not dictate our faith and beliefs. Jumping to number 5, seeing both the faithfulness and human flaws in our history makes it more believable and realistic, not less. And number 6, the responsible study of church history involves learning, repentance, and transformation. Please keep these principles in the back of your minds as we move forward tonight. Like many of you over the last 6 weeks, my heart is in Ukraine. In 2012, I had the opportunity to travel to Kyiv to teach church history to a group of mostly young adults. The plan had been to teach in Russia, but tensions were on the rise even then. So it was decided to instead bring the Russians to Kyiv. We slept, learned, and ate in the same small apartment. But we did have a few opportunities to explore the city before and after classes. I want to share with you tonight just a few photographs of places that until the last few days have been under siege, and some of which might now be destroyed. This is the Holodomor Genocide Memorial and Museum, which tells the story of the 3 to 5 million Ukrainians who starved to death in the 1930s. One of my undergraduate degrees is in Russian area studies, and I researched and wrote about Stalin's new economic policy that resulted in the famine. So I was particularly interested in the memorial, and it was the first thing we visited after our arrival. This famine was man-made. The little girl of the statue represents the most vulnerable, the children. She's clutching wheat gleaned from the field of a collective farm. Gleaning at the time was illegal and could result in imprisonment or death. In hindsight, making a genocide museum my first stop might not have been the best idea. The crushing sadness stayed with me throughout my time in the country. This sadness was generated, of course, by the needless deaths of millions of people, a genocide that is still very much a part of Ukrainian self-understanding. My depression was made worse by the reaction of the extraordinarily bright and well-traveled Russian students. They didn't believe that the genocide happened. They thought it was what today some would call fake news. I don't blame them. They were overcome by their culture. The Ukrainians can't forget the Holodomor, and that memory inspires them to fight to the death, to repel the invaders. And Russians can't remember it because they don't know anything about it. They didn't learn of it, which caused them to believe that they would be welcomed as liberators. Our news feeds are filled with horrific scenes from Ukraine, and they are undeniable proof that history matters. While visiting family in Nelson, British Columbia, I discovered another chapter in Russian history, the Doukhobors. Originating in Russia in 1701 or earlier, they are a small Christian sect who lived communally and still practice radical pacifism. They believe that any violence, including war, is unjustifiable under any circumstances. A Russian Orthodox archbishop first called them Doukhobors, which means spirit wrestlers, suggesting they wrestled against the Holy Spirit. The group, though, soon claimed the name and reinterpreted it to mean wrestlers for and with the Spirit. In a nonviolent response to attempts to draft Doukhobors into military service, they gathered up their guns and burned them in 1895. Persecution against the Doukhobors increased, and with the help of writer Leo Tolstoy and Quaker societies, also pacifists, around the world, 7,500 of them immigrated to Canada. Once there, they were soon in conflict with the government over their desire to own land collectively versus individually, and the refusal to swear an oath of allegiance to a government, since their only allegiance was to God. A very small and very radical group within the Doukhobors rejected any governmental authority and expressed their freedom from materialism by marching in the nude, protesting in parades, burning their own homes and the homes of others in their community, and burning government buildings. Doukhobors are an example of radical pacifists. And when I say non-violence, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you hear pacifist. Non-violence isn't really a good label for what we'll be talking about over the next year, but it is the label that World Conference Resolution 1319 has given us. In his book, Jesus and Nonviolence, A Third Way, if you haven't read it yet, you should, Walter Wink talks about why it isn't a great term. He notes that it's a negative, a not doing, avoiding something versus doing something. But he goes on to point out that the real problem is how we often understand it as a call to be submissive before authorities. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 7, which begins with, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities," is often interpreted to mean we must obey the government no matter what. "Turn the other cheek" has been understood to mean God commanded the powerless to accept the abuse of the powerful. "Love thy enemies" was interpreted to mean that the oppressed had to happily accept injustice without any consideration of changing the system that created it. Wink argues that this understanding of nonviolence as passivity is a perversion of the gospel. We will spend more time with Walter Wink in a future session. Reading Wink made me curious about the role that nonviolence played, if any, in the culture of Jesus. Context is critical when studying both history and scripture. The Jewish historian Josephus provides several accounts of an act of nonviolent protest in what is known as the Standards Incident. It occurred while Pontius Pilate was prefect of Judea, which meant it occurred during or not long after the life of Jesus. G.A. Williamson's translation of Josephus' The Jewish War, written in the 70s CE, tells the story this way. As procurator of Judea, Tiberius sent Pilate, who during the night, secretly and under cover, conveyed to Jerusalem the images of Caesar, known as standards. When day dawned, this caused great excitement among the Jews, for those who were near were amazed at the sight, which meant that their laws had been trampled on. They do not permit any graven image to be set up in the city, and the angry city mob was joined by a huge influx of people from the country. They rushed off to Pilate in Caesarea and begged him to remove the standards from Jerusalem and to respect their ancient customs. When Pilate refused, they fell prone all around his house and remained motionless for 5 days and nights. The next day, Pilate took his seat on the tribunal in the great stadium and summoned the mob on the pretext that he was ready to give them an answer. Instead, he gave a pre-arranged signal to the soldiers to surround the Jews in full armor, and the troops formed a ring 3 deep. The Jews were dumbfounded at the unexpected sight, but Pilate, declaring that he would cut them to pieces unless they accepted the images of Caesar, nodded to the soldiers to bear their swords. At this, the Jews, as though by agreement, fell to the ground in a body and bent their necks, shouting that they were ready to be killed rather than transgress the law. Amazed at the intensity of their religious fervor, Pilate ordered the standards to be removed from Jerusalem forthwith. There are other examples of nonviolent protest from the culture of Jesus, but does that mean that nonviolence was the norm during this time? No, it doesn't, and it wasn't. Rabbi John J. Tilson has explored the topic and had this to say: it will not be claimed that Jewish resistance was completely or even generally nonviolent. Rather, it should be noted that nonviolent struggles often took place in the context of bloody independence movements. Yet even within such contexts, nonviolent activities can have a major and constructive influence on the course of events. Let's turn our attention now to Community of Christ's history with violence. We first encountered it in a significant way in Jackson County, Missouri. Historian D. Michael Quinn pointed out in his The Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power, that there were significant expressions of peacemaking and even pacifism in the earliest years of the church. As members from New England settled in Jackson County, Missouri, among residents formerly from Kentucky and Tennessee, cultural differences escalated into armed conflict. Church leaders were tarred and feathered. The church printing shop was destroyed, as seen in this illustration, and our community members were violently expelled from Jackson County. In July 1833, church members in Missouri had initially refused to fight back when attacked or even to speak of revenge. According to member John Correll, quote, up to this time, the Mormons had not so much as lifted a finger, even in their own defense. So tenacious were they for the precepts of the gospel, turn the other cheek, end quote. Quinn points out that the Latter-day Saints also refrained from retaliating following a second attack in October and a third in November, when a church grist mill was destroyed. After turning the other cheek 3 times, church members did respond to a fourth attack, this time on the Big Blue River, by fighting back, much to the surprise of the Missourians. Quinn argues that this pattern of turning the other cheek was inspired initially by the example of Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon following their tarring and feathering in Hiram, Ohio at the John Johnson farm, and then by the revelation that would become section 95 of the Doctrine and Covenants. I'm guessing this is a section that most of us have not spent a lot of time with, but it is really important in the context of a discussion on nonviolence. So we're going to make up for that this evening. We are going to spend quite a bit of time with section 95. If you have a Doctrine and Covenants handy, you might want to grab it, because we're also going to use it in the breakout sessions. After calling on the Lord's people to renounce war and proclaim peace in Doctrine and Covenants section 95, 3D, the revelation continued, quote, "If men will smite you or your families once, and ye bear it patiently, and revile not against them, neither seek revenge, ye shall be rewarded. But if ye bear it not patiently, it shall be accounted unto you as being meted out a just measure unto you. And again, if your enemy shall smite you a second time, and you revile not against your enemy, and bear it patiently, your reward shall be 100-fold. And again, if he shall smite you the third time, and ye bear it patiently, your reward shall be doubled unto you 4-fold. And these 3 testimonies shall stand against your enemies, if he repent not, and shall not be blotted out. And now verily I say unto you, if that enemy shall escape my vengeance, that he be not brought into judgment before me, then ye shall see to it that ye warn him in my name, that he come no more upon you, neither upon your family, even your children's children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation. And then if he shall come upon you, or your children, or your children's children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation, I have delivered thine enemy into thine hands. And then if you wilt spare him, thou shalt be rewarded for thy righteousness, and also thy children and thy children's children unto the 3rd and 4th generation. Nevertheless, thine enemy is in thine hands, and if thou reward him according to his works, thou art justified. If he has sought thy life, and thy life is endangered by him, thine enemy is in thy hands, and thou art justified. So what that's saying is a violent response to an attack could only be justified after turning the other cheek 3 times. And even then, quote, if thou wilt spare him, meaning the attacker, thou shalt be rewarded for thy righteousness, end quote. Verses 6b through d of section 95 clarifies that Latter-day Saints are required to obey divine rule, not secular rule, regarding war and militarism. Back to the section. Quote, and again, this is the law that I gave unto mine ancients, that they should not go out into battle against any nation, kindred, tongue, or people, save I, the Lord, commanded them. And if any nation, tongue, or people should proclaim war against them, they should first lift a standard of peace unto that people, nation, or tongue. And if that people did not accept the offering of peace, neither the second nor the 3rd time, they should bring these testimonies before the Lord. Then I, the Lord, would give unto them a commandment and justify them in going out to battle against that nation, tongue, or people. So again, what it's saying is that they could fight back only after lifting up a standard of peace 3 times, being rejected 3 times, prayerfully asking for permission to fight, and then being commanded by the Lord to proceed.
LACH,
yes.
just real quick, we've had a comment that it's a little difficult to hear, so I don't know if it's possible for you to get, I have a feeling you're probably using a headset mic, but just
I'll talk louder. Any better?
yes, thank you.
Great. Doctrine and Covenants section 100 3D provided that commandment, calling for the redemption of Zion, Independence, Missouri, by power. Thus, with the commandment in place to use force, the army of Israel, later called Zion's Camp, was soon marching on Jackson County with Joseph Smith Jr. leading as commander-in-chief. The Missouri governor had apparently promised to use the state militia to recapture the land we had been driven off of if we had a strong enough force to hold it. Upon our arrival, though, the governor seems to have said, "Just kidding." With the failure of Zion's Camp to retake independence in June of 1834, the focus returned to peacemaking. From section 102, 11a through c. And again, I say unto you, sue for peace, not only the people that have smitten you, but also to all people, and lift up an ensign of peace, and make a proclamation for peace unto the ends of the earth, and make proposals for peace unto those who have smitten you, according to the voice of the Spirit which is in you, and all things shall work together for your good. The phrase ensign of peace would later be repurposed to become one of our favorite descriptors for the Independence Temple, dedicated to the pursuit of peace. We're going to move in just a minute to our first breakout session. You'll have 20 minutes, and again, feel free, if you have one handy, to grab a Doctrine and Covenants, section 95. You might have it as a Kindle app on your phone. I'm going to share a question and then paraphrase section 95. And then we're also going to drop it into the chat for you so that you can refer to it during your discussion. So the question: how do you feel about our canonized statement on the use of violence as found in section 95? And again, the paraphrase of that section: violence is only justified after lifting a standard of peace 3 times, being rejected 3 times, prayerfully asking for permission to fight, and being commanded by the Lord to proceed. And even then, you will be rewarded if you once again choose peace, if you restrain yourself. So how do you feel about that statement? I'm curious if most of you knew of its existence in section 95. So Amy and Janae, if you'll drop us into some breakout rooms, 20 minutes. The members driven from Jackson County had moved just north into Clay County, home to Liberty, Missouri. The citizens there initially welcomed us, but soon realized our numbers were large enough that we could potentially take over if we engaged in the political process. So they worked with the Missouri State Legislature to create a new county, Caldwell, just for us. Davies County was created at the same time and apparently understood to be not for us. Our numbers grew quickly, though, especially once our bank failed in Kirtland, Ohio, resulting in the near abandonment of that community. More than 500 members, the poorest of the poor, left in one day with Kirtland Camp and began the 600-mile walk to far west Missouri. We filled Caldwell County and spilled over into surrounding areas. Our neighbors took exception to that, and we were soon again engaged in violence. One of the first occurrences was in Gallatin, Missouri. It was the first election in the new county, and some of the Missourians decided that Latter-day Saints should not be allowed to vote. They started pushing around a small shoemaker by the name of Mr. Brown, and that soon spiraled out of control. There were about 50 Missourians and about 20 Latter-day Saints in this brawl, but the Latter-day Saints apparently made it to the woodpile first and armed themselves with clubs. I shouldn't feel that this is humorous, but some of my favorite quotes from all of Latter-day Saint history come from this brawl. and a guy by the name of John L. Butler, who was a very large man. According to John L. Butler, once this brawl started, he never struck a man the second time, meaning he didn't have to. And he said, as I struck them, I knew they would soon embrace the gospel. Talk about a true believer. They were pretty committed to their cause. Nobody died in that brawl, but rumors start spreading, and soon the conflict is escalating into what would become known as the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri. Things calmed down for a while and then picked up again. There were some of our members on the southern edge of the county, down near Ray County, that were kidnapped. If you weren't one of us, you might say that some of our spies were captured by a group led by a man that we knew to be a mobber. But it turns out that as we attacked this mob to free our kidnapped members, at that moment, this was not a mob. They were acting as the Missouri State Militia. This is the Battle of Crooked River. So we inadvertently at Crooked River attacked the Missouri State Militia, which is, of course, treason. Governor Boggs of Missouri then issued what is often known as the extermination order. That didn't mean leave or we'll kill you. It meant leave or we'll forcibly remove you. But whatever it meant, there were soon people killed. We often thought that what we call the Hans Mill massacre was the result of the extermination order. It now seems clear that word of that executive order had not yet reached that part of the state. So we don't now think that it was related. The people at Hans Mill, it was a small church settlement, a few mills, a blacksmith shop, a well being dug. It was a small settlement, but there were a significant number of new Latter-day Saints that were moving through on the way to far west, gathering from Canada, and they had camped at Hans Mill. These people had a truce with the neighbors in Livingston County, Missouri. We're going to leave each other alone. But one day they looked up and saw several hundred men on horseback coming out of the trees to the north. They knew that something was wrong. They were in trouble. So they lifted a white flag to surrender, but those attacking kept coming. We did have a plan to protect ourselves. The women and children ran across a mill dam, across Shoal Creek and up into the bluff above. The men gathered to the blacksmith shop under construction, and we're going to defend the community from there. It was not chinked yet, so imagine logs with gaps in between. And tragically, our plan to defend the community did not work. Soon, those attacking were just sticking their gun barrels through the logs and firing. And one of the most horrific accounts of that event, a little boy is hiding under the blacksmith's bellows. Somebody sees him and says, "Nits will make lice. He'll grow up to be a Mormon," and shot him in the head. That phrase, "nits make lice," was often used when exterminating Indians, when killing Native Americans as well. We quickly gathered the dead, 17 or 18, and buried them in a mass grave in an unfinished well there. Soon, thousands of militiamen were surrounding far west Missouri, the church headquarters. We spent a few frantic days throwing up breastwork, throwing up defensive barricades, and beating plowshares into swords, preparing to defend our community, but then realized that surrender was our only option, which we did. Joseph Smith was then court-martialed and sentenced to death, despite the fact that he was not in the militia. That would later be ruled unconstitutional. And of course, General Alexander Doniphan refused to allow that sentence to be carried out, saved Joseph Smith's life. We continue to honor Alexander Doniphan by naming Lake Doniphan, Camp Doniphan, after him. Joseph Smith was initially taken to jail in Independence for a few days, then to Richmond for a little while, and then eventually he spent about 4.5 months through the winter of 38 and 39 in Liberty Jail in horrific conditions. While he was there, the extermination began, meaning forcibly removing us from the state. Was the winter months. People were forced to leave most of their possessions behind and were driven from the state. It was cold and very wet as the Smiths are trying to leave, Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith, the parents of Joseph Smith Jr. Their team, their horses were ill, so they would have to get out and walk up every hill. The horses weren't strong enough to pull the wagons, and Joseph Sr. was also very ill. It was an extraordinarily difficult trip with no place to stay, very cold, very little food. At some point during the journey, a Native American took pity on them and helped to feed them. And at another really low point in the journey, a Missouri state representative, they didn't know that's who it was yet, but took them into his home and cared for them. They finally, thousands of us made it to the Mississippi River on the Missouri side, across the river from Quincy, Illinois. The river was breaking up, and so there are big ice chunks floating down it. It was not frozen anymore. You can't walk across it. And because of the ice flows, you can't boat across it. So they were stuck on the Missouri side. They had no choice but to lay down and go to sleep. When they woke up in the morning, there was about 6 inches of snow covering their blankets. Lucy Mack Smith said that it was only with the utmost difficulty that they could fold the frozen blankets. Finally, the river cleared. They were able to make it across to Quincy, Illinois, and these people were amazing. About 1,700 citizens of Quincy, Illinois, took in something like 5,000 Latter-day Saint refugees, political and religious refugees. They opened their homes and fed us and cared for us, just extraordinarily kind to us. And every time I read about the refugee crisis in the world today, I can't help but think of the people of Quincy and wonder if we don't have a moral obligation to do even more to help others in that same situation, since we have been there ourselves. We soon are moving north and establishing what would become Nauvoo, Illinois. It grew, was described as like a mushroom, meaning like magic, just springing up. And soon it went from maybe 6 homes to 1,200 log cabins and 300 to 500 timber frame homes and 200 to 300 brick homes, second in size only to Chicago in Illinois, growing extraordinarily quickly. We convinced the Illinois state legislature to give us a charter, the document that allows us to exist as a city. It also allowed us to create something called the Nauvoo Legion, which was a branch of the Illinois State Militia. And Joseph Smith Jr. was given the rank of lieutenant general in that militia, the first apparently since George Washington. That sounds nuts that the prophet of the church is also a lieutenant general. I think what's happening though is that Joseph had been illegally court-martialed in Missouri, believed that in order to be court-martialed, somebody had to outrank him. If he was the only lieutenant general in the land, he was protected from the abuse of the court-martial system, I think, as he understood it. And so I think that is why he was given the rank of lieutenant general. It soon is second in size only to the US Army, with they had maybe 8,000 men in the US Army. We probably had 2,000 or 3,000 in the Nauvoo Legion. And we were way too excited about the Legion. As people would gather to watch us parade or drill, they would leave terrified. If you read the paper on Joseph Smith III and the peace gene, you read the quote from the anonymous US artillery officer who called us repeatedly a warlike people and said that it's true, the Latter-day Saints are peaceable now, but they're like a lion asleep. Be careful, don't wake them. We understood that the Legion was only a defensive force, but our neighbors were terrified by it. And there are visitors to Nauvoo who comment on cannons in Joseph Smith's yard. Soon, things in Nauvoo are also spiraling out of control for a number of reasons, but primarily our use and abuse of a legal maneuver called habeas corpus that we were using to try and prevent Joseph initially from being extradited to Missouri, but later we used it to try and make sure that he didn't get taken to Carthage, Illinois, after the destruction of the Expositor, dissenting newspaper press. We were not successful. Actually, we were successful a couple of times in using it to keep Joseph from going to Carthage. That just made our neighbors angrier. Finally, he went and turned himself in, initially to face charges related to the destruction of the Expositor, but as he posts bail and prepares to leave, he's immediately rearrested on charges of treason for calling up the Nauvoo Legion to protect the city from the gathering mobs. The jail, now I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but if there is a conspiracy here, it's in the treason charge, because that's not a bailable offense. You can't just put up money and leave. You're stuck until you get in front of a judge, which meant it was easy for the Warsaw State Militia, acting alone, acting independently, to conspire with the Carthage Greys, who were supposed to be guarding the jail. They loaded their guns with gunpowder, but no musket balls. The Warsaw Militia, again acting independently, attacked, stormed the jail, killed Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. The belief among the local non-Latter-day Saints was that would be the end of the church. But by the summer of 45, that had not happened. And so they turned to something called wolf hunts to be rid of the Latter-day Saints. They began attacking outlying small church settlements. The illustration you see here is Solomon Hancock's farm, and the murder of Edmund Durfee is a detail in the top left. Wolf hunts by the summer and fall of 45, which caused finally church leaders to make an arrangement with the state leaders here to pack up and start leaving when the river ran and grass grew. So basically they're saying, we'll go in the spring of 1846. They ended up leaving early, beginning February 4 of 1846. Several thousand began leaving initially by ferry. Some then walked across the frozen Mississippi, thawed again, they kept going by ferry. And then thousands left over the summer. By the fall of 1846, there's just a small number of church members left in Nauvoo, including Emma Smith and her family. And the local non-Latter-day Saints decided everyone must go. So by September of 46, the Battle of Nauvoo breaks out. I don't use the term mobs lightly, but I'll call them mobs in this case. They argued they were coming into town to enforce arrest warrants, but the governor didn't want them here. They ended up attacking the city of Nauvoo with cannons. Latter-day Saints joined with something called New Citizens, non-Latter-day Saints, to try and defend the city. We're fighting back with cannons. We are not successful. And so the part of the surrender agreement, Battle of Nauvoo, every remaining Latter-day Saint must go. Joseph Smith III witnessed the violence and its aftermath during these most difficult times and was shaped by these experiences. As a little boy at Far West, he was separated from his father by the point of a Missouri militiaman's sword and would later be taken to visit his dad in the Liberty Jail. Forced to leave his father behind when expelled from Missouri with his mother and siblings, Joseph lived temporarily near Quincy, Illinois at the Cleveland farm, where Emma repeatedly lectured him on the dangers of guns. During the summer and fall of 1842, 9-year-old Joseph Smith III endured a number of searches of the family homes in Nauvoo as sheriffs from Missouri looked for his father during repeated extradition attempts. He watched as his father and uncle left for Carthage, only to return in oak boxes. And Joseph III was present at the public viewing of their bodies. Hiram was soon unrecognizable, and it was only through the burning of tar, vinegar, and sugar that it was bearable to be in the room. Young Joseph was present during at least one reinterment of his father, and the coffin was opened to allow for a lock of hair to be snipped as a relic. Following the outbreak of yet another violent conflict, he watched friends and family abandon Nauvoo to begin their epic trek west. A refugee once again, Joseph III would flee with his mother, brothers, and sister in September of 46 as the Battle of Nauvoo was about to break out to drive the last of the Latter-day Saints from the city. Profoundly impacted by violence and learning from personal experience, Joseph Smith III spent decades gently inviting the church to return to the early 1830s focus on the pursuit of peace. He critiqued the Nauvoo Legion, composed primarily of church members, questioning the apparent love of war demonstrated by the prominent place of the Legion and its children's counterpart in Nauvoo. Emma Smith, Joseph's mother, also opposed this militarism and encouraged her son to withdraw from the boys' troop. Joseph Smith III did so, acknowledging the authority of his mother, but not without mixed feelings because of the friendships he had created. In later years, however, Smith came to understand his mother's concern, not just for himself, but for the entire military aspect of Nauvoo society. He wrote in his memoirs, "I believe it was a mistake," he said, "to allow the spirit of militarism to take possession of the leading authorities of the church to such an extent that in the reports of their movements, there crept in the use of military appellations such as lieutenant general, general, colonel, major, captain, to the exclusion of the ecclesiastical designations such as president, high priest, apostle, elder, etc. Looking back along this pathway, I feel it was a pity that such a martial spirit crept in among them. However, and it was still a greater one that the leading minds of the church partook of it. Joseph III noted that the Legion helped to cultivate in the people a certain dependence upon human strength and power as a defense against the encroachment of the persecutors, perhaps a lamentable fact. Joseph III said that he did not imbibe the spirit of war and had little use for its dangerous weapons. He called out intolerance and threats of violence against dissenters. He worked to overcome the hatred he felt for a person who threatened his mother. And perhaps his most enduring legacy in the pursuit of peace, he helped to create the first church seal, which featured a lion, lamb, and child with the word peace underneath it. He used the pages of the Herald to publicly forgive a man responsible for the death of his father. For the purposes of our discussion tonight, one of the more interesting Joseph Smith III stories relates to the question of military service during the US Civil War. Joseph attended a recruiting rally for the Union in the fall of 1861 at the Nauvoo City Hall. After several speeches were given, an officer called for volunteers. There was no response. Several of Nauvoo's German residents arrived, fresh from the bar. Apparently, as a prank, friends began calling out Joseph's name for a speech. The mayor soon took up the call as well, and Joseph III took the floor. Here's how he remembered it. "I became imbued with the spirit of the occasion, and the fires of patriotism within me sprang into active flame. I made an impassioned appeal, moved by some inner light and urge which I did not stop to analyze, but the force of which I could not resist. Word got out that Squire Smith was speaking at the hall, and the room rapidly filled up. How long," he said, "I addressed the people, I do not now remember, but as I stopped, there was a rallying movement forward, and 17 names were signed in the enlistment rolls. That was the first and only war speech I ever made, he said. By 1863, when enlistments were not able to keep up with the North's need for troops, a draft was instituted, but one that allowed exemptions through substitution or payment of a fee. Much to the horror of Nauvoo citizens, it was discovered that their township had not been given credit for the many previous volunteers since the war began. This became a problem when there were not enough able-bodied men left in the community to fill their quota. Frustrated by the failure to credit those already serving, Nauvoo residents began to raise money sufficient to hire substitutes. According to young Joseph, as far as we were concerned, the question of becoming soldiers, either as volunteers or as under the draft, had involved from the very beginning many phases. As ordained ministers in a church whose rules of government and doctrine did not warrant the shedding of human blood, except it became necessary in defense of our families or ourselves, we felt it should be contemplated only as a last resort. In spite of this firm conviction, our spirits stirred deeply to the call of patriotic duty. We laid the matter before our fellow church members, and the question was discussed in the council meetings and in general assemblies with much the same solemnity that doubtless characterized the Puritans, Quakers, Shakers, or other denominations whose tenets forbade the shedding of blood. Prayers for guidance were fervently offered unto the Lord, he said. When the answer came, it was clear, definite, and unmistakable. In substance, it was as follows: do not enlist. Enlisting makes your military service an individual and voluntary action, whereby you will be responsible for the blood you might shed while in service. Wait. If drafted, the responsibility is lifted. In such case, do not hesitate to take your place in the ranks and to do your full duty as good soldiers and citizens, supporting the government to the best of your powers. In such an event, do not shirk any duty the service requires, even should it mean the shedding of human blood. For through the conscription, the deed becomes a national sin instead of a personal one. The nation as a whole will have to suffer for its sins, but you will not be held personally under moral obligations in the matter if you do not voluntarily enlist, he said. Heeding this message, the Smith boys did not enlist. And according to Smith's later reminiscence, we abided with calmness the outcome of the conscription draft later ordered. Alexander Hale Smith, Joseph III's brother, was eventually drafted, reported to Quincy, Illinois as part of the Nauvoo squad, and was able to rejoin his brother 2 weeks later in the walks of peace, when discharged as the result of an agreement between Iowa and Illinois officials, giving each state credit for their citizens who had crossed the Mississippi to enlist. But when, not long after Alexander returned home, the agreement between the two states fell apart, the draft was once again on. Joseph's diary, recorded in shorthand as the events unfolded, presents a slightly less calm picture than the later reminiscence had. So again, later he talks about waiting calmly. At the time, that's not what he's saying. Here's what he said at the time. At night, I write to Brother Rogers to tell him of the draft. What will he do with it? I am not prepared to say, but if I am drafted, I expect that I will have to go to do my duty as a soldier or be treated as a deserter or coward. May I be preserved from so hard a fate is my prayer to God. 5 days later, he recorded, Brother Derry is in trouble in regard to the draft, thinking of what will become of the wife and little ones. That's a situation that Joseph III shared. I am disturbed in my mind as well, but not to the extent that he is yet. I am of the opinion that if God desires me to fight, that I shall be protected by him who so orders it. A week later, Joseph served as secretary for a meeting of Nauvoo citizens trying to devise ways and means to raise money to secure volunteers to fill the quota of said town upon the present call of 300,000 to be enforced by draft. They were not successful. On March 10th of 1865, Joseph spent the day canvassing the Nauvoo Flats, raising $108 to pay volunteers. Meeting with others working on the same task at the end of the day, he found that they were short of the required amount. So he said, "We rounded up our shoulders to take the draft. I see no way to avoid it. At the same time," he said, "I should like to be able to do so if God were willing to permit me so to do." Joseph spent the next 3 days focused on a church conference and then a day tending to his wife and young daughter, all sick, before recording. "I feel reconciled to the draft, as I know I cannot help myself, so I intend to let it go as the Lord wills it to be." His last draft-related entry is found on March 15 of 1865. He said, "I hear no more about the draft, so I conclude that the citizens do not care for it much." Returning to Joseph's later reminiscences for the rest of the story, lots were cast and a number of Nauvoo area men were conscripted, including about 5 who were Community of Christ. The Smith boys were not among them. Much like Alexander's earlier experience, this group reported to Quincy, Illinois, and were soon discharged following Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Looking back on this exceptionally difficult time, Joseph reflected. "Constantly," he said, "I felt the dual impulse, the strong desire to enlist and the equally strong reluctance when I contemplated the grave moral responsibility which would be placed upon me in case I did. In writing this now, I do not intend to cast any reflection or place any blame upon any individual who did enlist, feeling it his duty to do so. A number of our brethren," he said, "offered their services in that way and were faithful under arms." I find this story fascinating for lots of reasons. For one, Joseph Smith III compared us to Quakers and Shakers. The Quakers, or Society of Friends, were established in England by George Fox in 1652. They believed that knowledge of Christ was possible without involving a church, a priest, or a book. Quakers were not creedal, and their understanding that God is in all people resulted in a significant focus on battling injustice and in the practice of pacifism. In 1747, Shakers split from Quakers in Manchester, England. Member Anne Lee had a manifestation of divine light in 1870, which resulted in her elevation to leader of the Shakers. And in 1874, she had a revelation directing her to establish the church in America, which for a time reduced the persecution the Shakers were suffering. Shakers lived communally, segregating men and women into different quarters. Like the Quakers, they supported gender equality, but unlike the Quakers, Shakers were celibate. Also, like the Quakers, Shakers were pacifists. We're going to move into our second breakout session. This time we're going to have 15 minutes, and you are welcome to use Google or your preferred search technology for this breakout session. We're going to drop the question into the chat. The questions are, how is Community of Christ similar to Quakers and Shakers? There were lots of clues in what I shared with you. And then the second question is, how is Community of Christ different than Quakers and Shakers? And you're going to have 15 minutes on this one. How is Community of Christ similar to Quakers and Shakers? How is Community of Christ different than Quakers and Shakers? I'll see you in 15 minutes. Like his father, Fred M. Smith was initially a strong proponent of peace. In 1910, against the backdrop of international unrest and growing US and European interests in the cause of peace, Fred, on his own initiative, had attended the American Peace Society's National Peace Conference. In 1911, General Conference, presided over by Joseph Smith III, passed the following resolution. Whereas, we look with favor upon the growing sentiment throughout the civilized world in favor of peace and against war, and a resort to arbitration in both international and national disputes. And whereas the Lord has commanded the church to renounce war and proclaim peace, also to lift up an ensign of peace and make a proclamation of peace unto the ends of the earth. Therefore be it resolved that we, the ministry and delegates of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in conference assembled at Lamoni, Iowa, this 11th day of April, 1911, unreservedly commit ourselves to the conservation of world peace. Fred's interest in the pursuit of peace did not extend to sympathy for the position of conscientious objectors after the outbreak of World War I. He commented that he had no time for pacifists or cowardly slackers. That's his language, pacifists or cowardly slackers. As shared in the resource, Four Approaches to Violence, when Fred visited the United Kingdom in 1920, Frank Edwards, a young church member and conscientious objector who had been imprisoned and sentenced to hard labor for his refusal to serve, was assigned as his secretary. Frank discovered that F.M. Smith was, quote, kindness personified, end quote. Smith later called Frank into the Council of 12 Apostles, and he later married F.M.'s daughter, Alice. Although I knew him as Uncle Frank, he is better known as F. Henry Edwards, and he was called to be a member of 2 first presidencies and became the most prolific church leader writer in the whole of the Latter-day Saint movement. F. Henry and Fred M. Smith had very different ideas about participation in war, but they both believed in the cause of Zion. In their personal relationships, they cared about each other and worked well together. They modeled loving, faithful disagreement for us today, as we also discuss the question of violence and non-violence leading up to the next World Conference. We do not always agree on the road to peace, but whilst we walk and talk, may we be kindness personified to each other. I want to finish by returning to Joseph Smith III. He made his clearest statement on the centrality of peace to the mission of the church just as the Civil War ended. Here's what he said. As to the principle of warlike saints, when God commands me to fight, I shall do so, but not before. And I am strongly inclined to believe that he will not require me to fight. Whether God may or may not at some future day raise up a warlike people is a question open for dispute to those who may love discussion. But all are agreed that there is now no present commandment. And in the absence of the command, peace is eminently our mission. Hence, my voice is for peace, said Joseph Smith III. Although making a link to section 95 of the Doctrine and Covenants and the requirement for a commandment from above before turning to violence, Joseph III also expressed doubt that such a commandment would come. In the weeks before us, we will explore 4 approaches to violence: holy war, just peace, and pacifism. As we do, I invite you to consider how section 95 relates to these approaches, meaning, does it reflect one or more of them? And to consider Joseph III's statement, I'm strongly inclined to believe that God will not require me to fight. So does that statement change the relationship of section 95 to those 4 approaches to violence? As the stories shared tonight illustrate, we are inheritors of a rich and sometimes painful history that can and should inform our ongoing discussion surrounding nonviolence in pursuit of peace on and for the earth. We have a little time left for questions. Some of you, especially on the East Coast, might want to call it a night if it's a little late for you, but I'm going to stay and try and answer any questions for a few minutes. I'm going to ask you to drop them into the Q&A, and Janae will share them with us. I'm going to stop the screen share, so we can see each other. Maybe. And I welcome questions through the Q&A feature.
We don't have the Q&A, we have chat.
Do that. Sorry, I jumped to the Historic Sites Foundation approach with their webinar.
I do see a comment that one of our Thursday sessions conflicts with the church history lecture series, and I apologize for that conflict. I am just noting that comment.
And they also tried hard not to conflict, but we're not entirely successful. Both are recorded, so you can still see them both.
Yes, thank you, LACH. LACH, how long were Emma and Joseph III gone from Nauvoo? And when did they return after 1846?
So Emma and Joseph III and the rest of the family fled on the steamboat Toby. They steamed north to Fulton, Illinois. That's September of 46, and they return in February of 47. What had happened is Emma had leased the Mansion House Hotel to a Mr. Van Tool, and she got word in Fulton, Illinois, where they had fled to. It's about 90 miles upriver. William Marks was there, good friend of the Smith family, as were other church members who had decided not to go west. So Emma got word that Mr. Van Tool was preparing to steal all her furniture as soon as the river thawed and he could sail south on a flatboat. So she rushed back, evicted him, moved back in, and lived out her life here. So from 1839 to 1879 and her death, she lived, with just that brief exception, on one of 3 corners of the intersection of Main and Water Street in Nauvoo.
LACH, we have another question. What is our church's stance on the USA military being larger than the next 10 largest militaries?
To my knowledge, the church has not taken a stance on that question. But what's the deadline for conference resolutions? Maybe we can address that.
The deadline is just a few weeks away. But yes, the reference to a number of World Conference resolutions would speak in general to that. Could you give some insight in World Conference Resolution 1177 about volunteering in military service? And
I don't think I can. I live in the 19th century.
So I do not have the World Conference resolutions pulled up at this time. If one of my other colleagues might be able to access that, and at least we can point out that reference.
And if you can capture who asked the question, I would love to do some research on it.
Yes, that was Mark Minton.
Great.
And I'll go ahead and go to the next question. My understanding was that the Nauvoo Legion was disbanded per an agreement between Joseph Jr. and the governor of Illinois, who gave his personal assurance of Joseph's safety. Is that correct?
I don't believe that the Nauvoo Legion was, I guess I'm not sure of the definition of disbanded. So it was still intact, meaning the charter still existed and the Legion was still part of the state militia after Joseph's death, and continued after Joseph's death. And I believe until the state revoked the charter, the belief was that we were abusing the power given to us. And so the state revoked that charter and the Legion would have ceased to exist at that point. I do think that the governor promised that he would protect Joseph. And so if by disbanded, meaning Joseph decided to go to Carthage and not take the Legion with him, then yes, that might be one interpretation. And I believe that the governor intended to protect Joseph. Sometimes we've turned Governor Ford into one of the evildoers in our story. I do not think he was. I think Governor Ford's flaw was that he had been an Illinois Supreme Court justice, and he believed in the power of the law. He believed that the law would work. And so I believe he was entirely shocked when some citizens decided that the law would not work, that there was no justice when it came to Joseph Smith, and they decided to go outside the law. Not only do I think that Thomas Ford wasn't in on the conspiracy, I think Ford might be right when he said that he himself was the subject of a conspiracy. The idea being that because Governor Ford was in Nauvoo when Joseph was killed in Carthage. And so Ford believed that by timing it that way, the intent was that word would reach Nauvoo, and he was planning on spending the night and then left. Ford believed that if word reached Nauvoo that Joseph had been killed while he was still in town, that we would then kill Ford, which would provide the excuse for the state to exterminate us, to again drive us out. So I do not think Ford was involved, and the question did not suggest that, but I do not think Ford was involved in Joseph's death intentionally.
It looks like we have a number of questions in the chat, so we'll get through as many as we can. Since we're recording, we are able to record the chats. If we don't get to the questions, LACH, you may get some emails.
Great.
This one is directed to you, LACH, as the facilitator, but I think it is a question for all of us to consider. LACH, can or might we look forward to a less violent path as opposed to a yes/no firm decision Do we have an idea of what we might look for in a future conference resolution to look like?
Yeah, so my sense right now is we're simply discussing and hoping to inform a first presidency statement versus coming up with any decision. And I'm really intrigued at what it might look like, because the more I engage in the discussion, the less I realize I know about the topic.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling increasingly ill prepared to take a position. I think I have a lot more research and study to do. And my sense with some hindsight is that the mission center that proposed the initial resolution understood what they were saying in very different ways than it was often interpreted in other parts of the world. I think they thought they were saying something different than what many people heard. But that's what happens when you engage in cross-cultural dialogue. I think it's really important. And that's also why I think it's really important to have this discussion, not just with the USA mission centers and fields, but to broaden that discussion as well.
Absolutely.
And then you layer, I mean, who could have imagined that we would be in a place to watch the Ukraine war as we were having this discussion? That's a whole nother layer of complexity now.
Absolutely. Do we call ourselves a peace church? Is the first part of this question, or should we call ourselves a justice and peace church? And I'll go on and then let you come back to those. If we say we are a peace church, does it not infer that we are like other peace churches? And goes on to say, I was involved in World Conference resolution that says the church will support the conscientious objector and one that serves in the military.
So yeah, I have had a lot of sometimes passionate conversations on this topic. We do call ourselves a peace church. I do not think that we fit into the historic peace church tradition at this point. The Quakers, the Shakers, United Brethren, those that have taken the position of pacifism for a long time. So we're not in that category. I know that Wikipedia is an iffy source, but I thought it was funny. If you look at historic peace church on Wikipedia, I think it is, Community of Christ shows up. It's kind of partway down the page, and it talks a little bit about kind of partially emerging peace church tradition. Yeah, I guess it depends on your definition of peace church on whether or not we fit that label. I do agree that we need to do even more on the justice front. And I've forgotten the rest of the question by now.
Those were the primary questions. And just mentioned that involved in the World Conference resolution regarding conscientious objectors being supported by the church.
Which I believe has been the case since the 1960s.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think conscientious objection only applies when there's a draft. If it's a volunteer military, then doesn't really apply.
Appreciate it, Bob.
Thank you to Blake West for providing the much of what is included in World Conference 1177. It is a lengthy resolution, and it is titled just peace. And it does make some strong statements in regard to our call to peace. So thank you, Blake, for providing that. Next question, how does our stance on peace impact on both unity and diversity and the right to choose either the path of peace or the path of the warrior.
Can you say that one again? Because I got caught up reading a comment that flashed across.
Yeah. How does our stance on peace impact on both the unity and diversity and the right to choose either the path of peace or the path of the warrior?
Well, my hope is that we can follow the example of Fred M. Smith and F. Henry Edwards. And even if people land in different places, that shouldn't stand in the way of loving, caring relationship. And I hope desperately that that's where we land. And I tried to lift up with Joseph III's discussion of the draft and the Civil War. He was trying to make it very clear, as was I, that folks who did enlist were not in any way less in his interpretation. I think the way he understood what he was saying is kind of like the way the word of wisdom was understood in the early church, the health code: advice, not commandment. Advice, not commandment. I think there is and will be lots of room in the church for people who enlist. So if anything I said suggested otherwise, that was not my intent.
We are just about at our closing time. There have been some questions as well as some responses as to where you can find World Conference resolutions. And this is a reminder on our new digital landscape. If you go to seaofchrist.org and scroll to the bottom to our ministry tools, that will take you to the site. You will have to have a login, and it may take a day to be able to access, but they are available on the Our Ministry Tools website. Final question, and we do have a number of questions still in the chats, and so LACH, we can talk about how, if we want to keep going or how we want to address that. The last question, congratulations, Dave Seagraves. Is a violent response justified when one is confronted with an imminent threat to one's life or well-being, as the people of Ukraine are currently experiencing? I'll let LACH respond, but again, this is a question for all of us to consider as part of this discernment.
Yeah, that's what we're here to discuss. If it was my life, I know, I think, no, I don't know what I would do. I think I know what I would do, but until I am in that position, I do not know what I'm going to do. Joseph III, historically, seems to have thought pretty clearly that, yes, to protect the life of yourself or your family, a violent response was justified. I believe was his take, but that's the discussion that we're engaged in.
We are at that time. There was a question about are other nations taking the opportunity to share in similar sharing experiences on this topic, and the answer is yes. This experience is in response to the First Presidency's invitation to the Council of 12 to engage all fields in conversations around nonviolence. And so this is the first experience scheduled, but we are in the process of scheduling these conversations across all fields of the church. And we hope to find a helpful way to share some of these experiences and some of these variety of perspectives as part of this experience in dialogue together. So since we are past our time, and LACH, I'll let you determine how long you might want to remain. But let me just say for all, this has been recorded. We will continue recording just for a period of time. And we will capture what is in the chats and try to get those responses to questions that have been raised, but I do appreciate the responses as well as the pastoral care that I have noticed as part of the chats. So we do hold those in Ukraine, especially our loved ones and those that are on this connection. So Carla and Kuzma and your families, we continue to hold you in loving prayer. Friends, thank you so much for being part of this experience. We are, our hope is that this is not the only opportunity that you take to engage in these exact topics and conversations. And part of the purpose of providing the recordings is that they can be used in small groups, they can be used in congregations to prompt further discussion. And that is our hope, is that we enlarge and expand our perspectives and what we hear from one another. We will not be gathering next week because it is Holy Week and many of you will be engaged in Maundy Thursday activities. So in 2 weeks, we will be back on the same link and we will share in the focus of scripture with Ron Harmon as the facilitator. It's the same link, but you will be sent a reminder link. So thank you again. Good night and be well. And LACH, I'll let you sign off, LACH. So if we want to close down shop, we can respond in other ways unless you want to stay on for a few minutes. I'll let you make the call.
So I'll stay for a minute or two. Most of these are wonderful comments for further discussion, but I'll stick around for a minute and most of them are not going to be short answers or any answers, just more discussion.
All right. Thank you. If you need to sign off, please feel free to do so. And LACH, I'll let you take the lead in terms of what you want to respond to next. So
Great.
Thank you all.
I'm just flipping through. Lots of great questions. Most of them are not history questions.
I hope everybody is taking notes of the questions that are raised, that you're noticing them in the chats, because as LACH indicated, they are important for us to consider as part of our ongoing conversations.
Yeah, I feel pretty excited that we got a conversation going here. Walter Week comments in The Powers That Be, I began to realize that if violence was my last resort, then I was still enmeshed in the belief that violence saves. Then I just dropped part of it. So Gandhi said, if nonviolence was not addressing an injustice, he thought violence was better than injustice. I was kind of surprised at that, but he also thought that there was always a nonviolent solution.
LACH, I don't know if you noticed or if Steve and Cherry are still on. There is a history question from Steve Kohler. Have you seen that?
I have not.
Okay, the question, has the Warsaw Masonic Lodge ever been rechartered? And do you believe that that lodge was responsible for Joseph's death?
So I think it was the Warsaw State Militia that was responsible versus the Warsaw Masonic Lodge. But I do think there were Masons in the militia. And the reason I think that is Joseph apparently recognized some of them. And so there's some suggestion that his last words were, "O Lord, my God," which is apparently the beginnings of the Masonic sign of distress. "O Lord, my God, is there no help for a widow's son?" or something like that. So I don't think it was a Masonic conspiracy. I think it was the Warsaw State Militia acting independently, some of whom were Masons. And I'm not sure if there's a Warsaw Lodge at the moment.
So Steve and Cherry, I do see that you are still on. Good to see you, friends. I think those are the questions. I did see a question from Umberto, and this again is part of kind of an ongoing, not necessarily history related, but how does this stance on nonviolence impact issues that cross cultures? An example, the drug cartels that do damage not just to the US, but also Mexico and other Latin countries. And so, LACH, I don't know if you have a response, but Umberto, thank you for raising that point, for that reminder, and just to re-emphasize that we are engaged in cross-cultural conversations, and we know that we are connected beyond our borders. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and there's clearly lots of ways to do violence to people beyond immediate physical contact.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll call it a night, but I welcome emails. Would love to continue the conversation. It's been a lot of fun, and I enjoyed opening up for questions just to see how it would go. Clearly a lot of passion in this topic.
Yes, and thank you, LACH. I remain amazed by what lives in your head. An ability to hold all of that information is truly amazing, and a gift and blessing to all of us, to the church, and to this this experience and to this process of dialogue.
Very kind. It's more 19th century than 21st, but there's only so much room. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you again, LACH. Thank you all.